You know, sometimes history is just a story that gets told again and again and again and again until it becomes accepted as truth, even by the historians. They write a book about the same kind of subject matter and they say, you know what, I don't have to look into this. This has already been done. It becomes calcified, just like a scab, keeping all of the real stuff underneath until a different kind of historian shows up. A historian who says, well, how do we know this is true? And that historian's going to go back to the original source material. That historian's going to find new original source material. What that historian is going to do, that historian is going to open the scab. So I'm here in Squirrel Hill, Pennsylvania, which is a neighborhood in Pittsburgh, and I'm going to be talking to David Garrow. David Garrow has written two monumental biographies. The first on Martin Luther King Jr., Bearing the Cross, which won him the Pulitzer Prize. But I'm here to talk to him about his second book, which is about Barack Obama, Rising Star. So come along.
Hey.
Hi, I'm David.
Hey, good to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Great.
Well, there's so many questions I want to ask you about Barack Obama, young Barack Obama, but let me start with today. You know, as I was coming out here, I was thinking about the fact that every president in my lifetime, after they've left office, their approval ratings always go up, right? I mean, Jimmy Carter went from being the least liked person to a virtual Christ figure. George W. Bush went from being a war criminal to this fuzzy person who paints and holds hands with Michelle Obama. Barack Obama, it seems to me, is the first president in my lifetime whose approval has gone down after he left the office. So I'd like to ask you if you think that's an accurate perception and why that is.
I certainly think it's an accurate perception. Two thoughts come to mind. Number one, I think as the last 6 plus years have passed, the Obama foreign policy record looks much more fragile, much more open to criticism than was true at the time. Pretty much giving Russia a pass in 2014 when it seized Crimea and then invaded eastern Ukraine. That looks dramatically worse, after the, full-scale Russian invasion of 2022. Giving Syria a pass, probably the most famous incident of the Obama presidency, Barack saying that if the Syrian regime used chemical weapons, that was going to be a red line for the United States to do something. They went ahead, used the chemical weapons, and Obama choked. He said, we're not going to do anything unless Congress, votes to approve it. That still gets cited, I think, almost weekly in the press nowadays. The other, I think, equally significant factor is that during the presidency, Obama was visible on television every single day. I mean, to my mind, he was significantly overexposed. I mean, too much of a sort of nonstop presence. And then once he left office, he virtually disappeared. Public sightings of him, at least to my experience, on TV news now are very rare. And so he went from being this ubiquitous presence in American life to someone who was totally out the door.
It seems, you quote somebody or other in your book who says he's a Rorschach test. We kind of see what we want to see when we look at Barack Obama. And I feel like a lot of people while he was president were kind of trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. Of course, there were these tremendous expectations when he came in. We really thought he was going to make these huge differences. And as the presidency wore on, there was a lot of excuses. Well, the economy is terrible, and it's different being president than not being president. And I think a lot of people expected more from him. And,
Yes.
and at the end of the day, we look at what happened, and it's kind of a disappointment, isn't it?
Exactly. If we think back to, election night, November 2008, and that scene in Grant Park, Chicago, which was like some, heroic rock concert type event. And the inauguration, similarly, in January of 2009. I think expectations were especially high, given that he's the first African American president, that his victory would end racial tensions in the United States. And we look at the polling over the 8 years of that presidency, and public opinion on racial issues, on racial happiness, racial satisfaction, went down over the course of the presidency. Now, there's no question that some of the antipathy towards Obama during the presidency came from people who thought that he seemed like a foreigner. The notions that he was secretly a Muslim, which is a crock. But, the fact that he has an African name, that he did spend part of his childhood in Indonesia, that he was basically raised in Hawaii, all of those, above and beyond his, biracial skin color, I think without a doubt contributed to the right-wing hostility towards him. My own conversations with him, 3 days over the course of 2016, left me with a very strong belief that the experience of the presidency, of absorbing that criticism, made him much more consciously black in 2016 than he had been in 2009.
I remember seeing Harry Belafonte speaking at an event, and he told the story that Barack Obama went up to him and said, "When are you guys going to give me a break?" And that Harry Belafonte said, "What makes you think we haven't been giving you a break since day one?" So you have the issue of the people on the right who are dissatisfied, but then the people on the left did not really get what they expected from him.
Barack himself is much more thin-skinned about criticism than I think most people immediately perceive. And I think there's no doubt that the vast majority of African Americans were very reticent about expressing criticism of him, certainly during the first 6 years or so of the presidency. But there's no question that there, over time, came to be a feeling of disappointment across Black America that Obama wasn't being more explicitly black in his presidency. Now, everyone around Obama goes back to that Henry Louis Gates experience early in the presidency, where Gates had gotten into a disagreement with a local cop in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Barack spoke out in defense of Gates, and the public reaction to that was humongously negative. That seemed to be a warning lesson that Obama needed to stay away from expressing, statements that identified him as decidedly black in his official role.
Speaking about him being thin-skinned, I saw that you were in the news recently for saying that Obama is as insecure as Trump.
I think politicians as a group are more insecure than the average human being. I worked in the U.S. Senate back in 1972 when I was in college and saw a lot of U.S. senators then, and have seen a fair amount of politicians over the years. For me, as someone whose life experiences have really been grounded in Martin Luther King and knowing all the people that worked with Dr. King, King was an almost unique public figure because he didn't want to be a celebrity. He got drafted into being the spokesperson for the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And he always felt he was being dragooned into all of these subsequent civil rights events. The sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, Birmingham, Selma. So King was not someone who had an ego need to be on the public stage. The great irony of the FBI wiretapping of King is that again and again we hear King being incredibly self-critical and utterly dismissing, being named Time Man of the Year, all the other awards. King was very uncomfortable being a celebrity, and he felt that he was always given too much credit for what the civil rights movement was doing. Now, that's the opposite of what we have with people who put themselves forward as political candidates. Different in kind from someone like Jesse Jackson, who had worked for King, but who was, relentlessly propelling himself forward. And that's the fundamental difference, between people who are again and again and again running for office, as Barack did. Barack had the belief very early in life, as a young man in his 20s, that he was destined for political greatness. His wife, her family, thought this was almost laughable, that he had these, beliefs that he, could well become president of the United States, decades before it actually happened. So there was a drivenness to Barack, and there's a drivenness to most politicians that is, clearly, fulfilling some deep need.
Of course, presidents make a big statement by the bust they put into the White House these days, and it was before Barack. There was Winston Churchill, who got sent away, and Martin Luther King Jr. Now President Biden has Robert F. Kennedy. But of course, these are the two people you've studied, Martin Luther King Jr. And Barack Obama. And Obama brought up Martin Luther King Jr. quite often, which is why it's kind of ironic that he has this discussion that he has with Harry Belafonte, who of course was there at the time. But of course, when you're president, civil rights is never a fun thing. So I understand that, but isn't it surprising that after he left office, that he hasn't been more of a presence on the civil rights front? And you think about Martin Luther King Jr., who refuses to accept any money for his awards because he says that's everybody, that's for all the people who marched and who died, and who's always putting that cause ahead of himself at all times, always keeping in mind trying to end discrimination and trying to help people out of poverty. And that when Obama leaves the White House, instead we see someone, as you say, in Martha's Vineyard and who's partying with Jay-Z. And did anything in your studies of Barack Obama as a young man prepare you for that kind of eventuality?
All of the African American folks in Chicago whom I interviewed, who knew Barack, from the late 1980s, up through 2004, the clear consensus among all of those people was that, Barack wasn't really from Chicago, that Barack was not black in the sense that someone who was native to the south side of Chicago, had experienced black identity there. But they always believed that Michelle Robinson Obama, who is an exemplar of working class south side black Chicago, they always thought Michelle would keep Barack grounded in his identity. And so while they're not surprised about Barack's post-presidential evolution, they're tremendously saddened that Michelle has gone along with all of this. Earlier you mentioned Jimmy Carter, whom I knew some when I lived in Atlanta. As my historical colleague Kai Bird emphasized to me several years ago now, who's written a biography of Carter, Carter's post-presidency is a real model for how someone who didn't have a very successful presidency can, in the ensuing subsequent decades, have a huge impact on the world. I mean, Carter has probably, without question, had the most impactful post-presidency, really of anyone, certainly since the Civil War era. And, Obama, is not an old man even today. Obama could have gone the Jimmy Carter path, and instead, he's gone this sort of, hanging out with celebrities, and that to me, when I have said, on the record in the past that I think there are some deep insecurities in Obama, why does someone who's been president need to hang out with, Beyonce, Jay-Z, Richard Branson? That to me is per se evidence of some sort of neediness that, as a president, as a former president, you just shouldn't be part of you.
And to go along with that a little bit, something I've noticed, and I don't know if this is a correct perception, but I've always noticed in terms of Barack Obama and Joe Biden that Obama seems to need to get his little shots in against Biden. And what I've noticed, first of all, when Biden was running, Obama shows up the last couple weeks of the campaign. And I don't know if you watched these speeches, but he's running back and forth on the stage and jumping, and I mean, he's showing his physicality to a degree I've never seen him do. Of course, compared to Joe Biden, who doesn't have that kind of physicality. And, at the inaugural, he walks up, and here's, Joe's one of the most important elections in our lifetime. He gives him a fist bump and then the long hug to Kamala Harris, kind of making that the main thing. But when I really realized that he was kind of passive-aggressively taking shots was when his dog died. And I don't know if you saw what he said. This was, at a time, the only real discussion, the only criticism of Biden really was that his dog kept biting people.
Right.
And I love that Joe Biden defends his dog no matter what, when the dog is clearly guilty. So
right.
That's, as a dog owner, I appreciate that. But so when Obama's dog died, he tweeted out that his dog was all bark and no bite. And it just seemed like such a passive-aggressive shot at Biden. The one place where he would, and I know if anyone asked Obama that, he would, you're being ridiculous, you're reading too much into it. But what's going on there between him and Biden?
I hadn't known about that comment, but now when you describe it, that doesn't surprise me at all. That sort of teasing, aggressive humor. Without question, Biden was intensely loyal to Obama, during his the 8 years of the vice presidency. Even though in the famous, Bob Gates quote, from when Gates was Secretary of Defense, that, Joe Biden's been wrong on every major foreign policy, question of, I didn't say his lifetime, but whatever time period he cited. Biden opposed the raid that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. I think, to my judgment, what we've been seeing this last, coming up on 2 years now, is an inescapable realization that, for better or worse, the Biden presidency is much more consequential for America, for the world, than was the Obama presidency. We look back over the last, say, 30 years, even Barack multiple times has talked about how important Ronald Reagan's presidency was. More so than, say, George Bush #1, more so than the Clintons. Then, George W. Bush's presidency was, highly consequential for the United States. Similarly, in, mainly bad ways, though not all bad ways, the Trump presidency. And now, because of world events, #1, Ukraine, #2, Israel, and this astonishing level of left-wing anti-Semitism across the Western world, what we're seeing now during the Biden presidency is vastly more consequential for the world long-term than really anything that happened during Barack's 8 years. We look back and people once upon a time wanted to say that the Affordable Care Act, was the cornerstone of the Obama presidency. In the retrospective lens of history, the Affordable Care Act looks pretty small to me as a historian, and my views on health care are far to the left. I mean, I lived in Britain for 6 years. I believe in single-payer, government-controlled medical industry. And so I think the realization that even though he was there for 8 years, that it did not become in any respect a transformative presidency, that's a difficult thing to live with and wake up at 4 a.m. thinking about.
Let's talk about your decision to write this book. And a lot of what we talk about on this program, I'm interested in historians and the process and the economics and what it takes to write a serious book. Because to decide to spend 9 years, and I don't know if that was your decision when you started, but that's a major undertaking, and the economics of the publishing industry don't really push for that anymore. They really kind of, I noticed that the most famous historians right now, they seem to write about 3 people. They write about Lincoln, and then they do, it's like these 3 guys, and we keep getting books about them. Because if you wanted to write a serious book on George W. Bush, which boy do we need, but it's going to take you 20 years, and who's buying that for a Christmas present?
Right.
So when did you decide to write this book on Barack Obama, and why did you make that decision?
When Barack won the Iowa caucuses, the first event of the 2008 presidential primary season in early 2008, I was embarrassed that I knew next to nothing about him other than what I'd passingly read over the years in the New York Times. And so I got a paperback copy of Dreams from My Father and read it while on vacation in Europe. And to someone who's a historian, you immediately realize that this is a book with composite characters, that most everyone has a pseudonym, the chronology's jumping around, and he describes it as a memoir, but just from first glance, it's clearly fictionalized to some degree, and that made me very curious in particular about who were the real people behind these composites and pseudonyms. So I started reading all of the biographical journalism, newspaper and magazine profiles that existed, as of spring, summer of 2008, running up to the nomination, to the presidential election. And I was increasingly disappointed by how unthorough, uninquisitive virtually all of that journalism was. They'd found like 1 or 2 of the people who Barack had been close to when he was a community organizer, Jerry Kelman, Mike Kruglich, but they hadn't gone and found most of the people who were members, community members, rather than the white organizers. This is Chicago, 1985 to 1988, Barack's first real immersion in a black community, in a black identity. And so I made the decision right after the inauguration, early 2009, and I'm living in Britain during all those years, to start spending significant time in Chicago interviewing people about that 85 to 88 period. And I was initially thinking I would do some long magazine piece just about the community organizing background. And then once I started spending time in Illinois, it gradually dawned on me that I'd have to do something bigger. And I started seeing people, tracking down people who'd been important during Barack's subsequent years after Harvard Law School, when he's back in Chicago in 1991 to 2004. He runs a voter education project. He gets elected to the state legislature, loses a congressional race, then sort of comes out of nowhere to win this U.S. Senate seat in 2004. And what I experienced again and again was that there were all of these documents around that people had retained that reporters generally aren't interested in. And you've got to go see people in person. I mean, I would sometimes make a joke about being a bag historian because basement, attic, garage. Most people, irrespective of what they've done in life, hang on to things. And so it turned out there was a remarkable amount of documentary material detailing, things that Barack had been involved with over the course of the 1990s up through that Senate race. And all these people were available. Now, when you're looking for, people in politics, people who went to Harvard Law School with Barack, they're easy to find. When you're looking for people whose surname is Smith and they lived in public housing on the far south side of Chicago, they don't have web pages, they generally don't have email. You're sort of piecing together phone numbers. But going back to all of my work on Dr. King 40 plus years ago, finding people and going and talking to people who've not been interviewed much is a great, great joy, as is finding documents that people haven't found before. So it's a slippery slope, but it became clear to me pretty early on that there had to be a definitive pre-presidential look at Barack's life that went beyond all of this disappointing journalism.
And much of the, we talk in this show about opening the scab, kind of getting the scab and getting to the truth underneath that. The scab was really Obama's own description of his youth, which everyone was just pretty much following along. Is that right?
Well, what was most striking to me, and this took place during the summer of 2009, was that it was clear from the journalism that he'd spent most of those 3 years when he's in Chicago, 85 to 88, living with some unnamed woman who was a grad student at the University of Chicago. But none of the journalists had made any effort to identify this person. And I'm thinking, this is very curious. Now, it was pretty clear that this woman was not African American. So I thought, even at the time, that this aversion was that, there was something sort of racially tacky about looking for Obama's white girlfriend. But anyone who's been a student or a faculty member at a university in decades past knows there are student directories. And the address that Barack lived in at Hyde Park during those years was public record. So I had my young graduate assistant at the University of Chicago, there in Hyde Park, go to Regenstein Library and pull these dusty student directories from 1987, 1988 off the shelf and look for this address. And that's how we found Sheila Mayoshi Yeager, Barack's girlfriend. We also found the couple who lived right upstairs from them, who've both been academics at North Carolina State University for a fair number of years. And so finding Sheila, who's a professor at Oberlin, a well-known U.S. expert on the Koreans. Sheila is half Japanese, half Dutch. Her Dutch family are in Yad Vashem as heroes who tried to successfully save Dutch Jews from the Nazis during World War II. When I first emailed Sheila, I believe her first email back to me said something like, "Oh, am I glad that it's you who found me." And so Sheila becomes a definingly important person in Barack's life. They remained involved with each other for a number of years after Barack left in '88 to go to law school at Harvard. He had had two serious previous girlfriends, Alex McNair, Genevieve Cook, before he goes to Chicago in '85. But those women are significant figures in his life, especially Sheila. And that became really foundational to me because Sheila was sort of there at the creation when Barack comes for the first time to the conclusion that he's going to pursue a political career and that going to Harvard Law School is the sort of gold star he wants on his resume in order to pursue a highly credentialed political career.
So we see two major changes, really, that Barack Obama goes through as a young man. And it's always interesting when you look at biography to see changes people go through. The first is really, you write a lot about his earliest years in Hawaii and how unexceptional he really is. That none of his friends from then, some of them don't recognize him when they see the speech.
Yes.
When he makes his speech at the Democratic Convention, they don't even recognize Barry as being that same person. So that's the first change that you look through. And then the second change, which Yeager is really a part of, is as he changes politically in terms of, you describe him as being very left of center, being very concerned about poverty, all of these things as a younger man, and that starts to shift. And I want to talk about Yeager a little bit with that, but what are your thoughts on these two changes? And I'm really curious about your ideas about the first change, because it's really funny as you're reading the book. It starts to get aggravating because everything goes so well for him. And everyone he meets says, this is the greatest person I've ever met. And everyone he meets says, let me give you a job. And after a while, you're like, I'm tired of reading about you, Barack. But this change happens. And he becomes, you talk about when he's asked basically to write his memoir. And which doesn't happen, right? Nobody goes and asks you to write a book when you've never written a book before. But then you read his elevator pitch that he wrote, and you think, boy, that's really good. Right. that if you got that, you'd think about publishing that. So if you could address
Right.
that a little bit, those changes.
Up until summer of 1985, when Barack leaves New York and drives to Chicago to begin his work as a community organizer. He's 24 at that time. Up until that trip, he's a complete nobody. No one had thought he was particularly notable as a high school student in Hawaii. Nobody thought he was in any way notable as an undergraduate, first at Occidental College east of LA for 2 years, then his 2 very low visibility years at Columbia University in Manhattan. And then he works a series of really underwhelming jobs in Manhattan, 1983 to 1985, before he answers this magazine ad for a community organizing job in Chicago, gets interviewed, gets hired, and drives himself to Chicago. It's the years working on the far south side, trying to build this congregation-based community organization. That's what makes him grow up. That's what gives him a political identity and gives him a purpose in life. It was very tiresome, difficult work. And the sort of bright light that he sees during those years is Harold Washington, the first black mayor of Chicago, who was a sort of larger-than-life figure, a highly personable, charismatic man, had all sorts of difficulties as mayor. But Washington gives Barack a sort of idea that if you can become mayor of Chicago, you can have vastly more impact than being a community organizer. Washington had a law degree, had been in Congress before he became mayor. Washington dies very suddenly of a massive heart attack just when Barack is deciding to apply to law school. And that's the goal that Barack has in mind. So when he gets to Harvard in 1988, he's an adult. When he got to Chicago 3 years earlier, he was not an adult. He was still a kid. His best friend at Harvard during those 3 years, 88 to 91, Rob Fisher, a number of years older, already had a PhD, had been an economics professor before deciding to go to law school. Rob Fisher may be the brightest human being I've ever met, and I've met a lot of wonderful people from Nelson Mandela on down. But Barack and Rob are this remarkable duo of friends those 3 years at Harvard. They start writing a book manuscript together. They do 2 long chapters, about 200 pages, one drafted by Rob, one drafted by Barack. And in class after class after class at Harvard Law School, Barack is a standout presence. There's one class in urban government law where the professor quotes Barack on the final exam, not by name, but all the students realize, oh, he's asking us to analyze something that Obama said back during the middle of the semester. And Harvard Law School is, an intensely elite competitive place. When Barack then gets elected as head of the Harvard Law Review, first black person in that role, that leads to, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, writing about him as this first black. And that's what leads to people wanting, people in publishing, wanting him to write some sort of a book. Now, the book goes through several iterations. It becomes extremely problematic, difficult for him. Rob Fisher's helping him a lot with that. And then finally, 4 years after he graduated Harvard Law, the book finally comes out and gets very little attention and sells, very small number of copies. It only gets rediscovered come 2004.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this about Law Review, and then I want to talk about Harold Washington a little bit. But what was interesting was he becomes president of the Law Review, and there's all these ideas that he's going to really fundamentally change that apparatus. And immediately, when they see the masthead, when they see who gets the most important spots, everyone is disabused of that. So if you could talk about that a little and how that came about again when he was elected president.
The election process at the Harvard Law Review was like a presidential primary that we've all seen. You've got 15 people running, and it goes through sequential rounds, and people drop out, and eventually it comes down to the 2 surviving finalists. And all of the conservative students, the Federalist Society then was a sort of nascent creature. The conservative students all, in the end, go with Barack rather than his sort of standard liberal competitor because they think Obama is the person who's going to be less ideological. Now, there's a sort of eerie foreshadowing in this, of course, because indeed, as president of the Law Review, Obama is this rather reserved, middle-of-the-road figure, and the most racially committed black students on the Law Review are very unhappy that Barack is allowing the conservatives to have a sort of proportional voice rather than stuffing them. And so I think it's quite fair for people to see that as foreshadowing his presidency. where he, is not an ideological crusader, certainly with regard to race, and where he's, trying, to be something of a middle-of-the-road figure.
I love how he keeps telling people, don't worry, nobody reads these articles,
Yes.
which is, of course, absolutely true.
Yes.
Only if you're a lawyer that needs the cites that are on the bottom of the article does anyone read them. And he seems to have this kind of wisdom about law school, which is, this is just, you go for 3 years and you get this degree, and let's not get all caught up in the drama, which is, I guess, an early version of no drama Obama, because the way you describe it, there's just all of this drama that occurs in law school, and he just is aloof, doesn't get dragged into it.
As someone myself who taught on law faculties for over 20 years, even though I'm a historian, not an attorney, you realize very quickly that older students, like Barack, like Rob Fisher, people who had several years out in the world before law school rather than going straight from undergrad to law school, those are not always, but very disproportionately, your strongest students, because they're just more mature. Mm-hmm. They've had real world experience. I think the same thing is true from what I've read about business school students.
I have to say that was the hardest part to read, having been in law school. It was like going back in time. But the fascinating thing about Harold Washington and Obama is that you quote him several times, kind of criticizing Harold Washington, who of course dies pretty quickly into his term, that he didn't leave anything behind. It was all charisma. Yes. And I find that incredibly ironic, given that Barack Obama defeats the old order, and then not only is nothing left behind, he really acts to help Hillary Clinton get the nomination when he's done, as if that whole fight didn't happen, or there really was no reason for him to run to begin with. So I'd like you to address his continuous comments about Harold Washington and
right.
how that relates to him.
When Harold Washington died very suddenly in November of 1987, his majority on the Chicago City Council collapsed. And there was this internecine warfare of who would end up succeeding and becoming the new mayor. And it's a very unpleasant, messy process. And Barack is right there, sometimes in person, watching this, very depressed by it. So he realized quite correctly that Mayor Washington, despite having this huge presence and being a hugely inspirational figure for black Chicagoans, when he dies, leaves no after effect. It all just crumbles. And so Barack took from that the notion that you should build institutions, that you should build an organization. Something should outlive you. You see that even in what he and Rob Fisher at Harvard, write about black politics and the legacy of the '60s civil rights movement. But as you quite rightly, suggested, come the presidency, Barack forgets that lesson. He had built a very powerful campaign organization with a huge structure of supporters, and then as president lets that go to seed. And he also all but ignores the Democratic National Committee and state and local election efforts. During the Obama presidency, the number of Democrats in state legislatures across the country declines by hundreds and hundreds. I'm not going to try to get the numbers correct off the top of my head, though they're in Rising Star. And so then when the Obama presidency ends, it just ends. He hasn't built anything that is a political presence going forward. And even in the present day, they're building this Obama Center in Hyde Park, in what Jackson Park, which drew a lot of criticism from people that live right there. But it's not going to be a presidential library. You know, there are not going to be any papers. You don't go there to study the Obama legacy. The Obama papers are all in a suburban warehouse. And to me, as a historian, you know, who talked with him a good bit, I full well, it's no surprise to me that he does not want to encourage research on his presidency because it's by its nature going to be critical. He doesn't want that. But it also means that there's not really a political legacy. They had a reunion in Chicago very recently, here fall of 2023, of everyone who'd worked, you know, in the campaign in 2008, a sort of 15-year reunion. And I was really astonished at how almost no public press attention this got. Maybe I read too much about Ukraine and Israel, but I saw, I think, a grand total of one story about that in the Chicago press.
Well, and this is a way I can kind of circle back to Sheila. The one thing people talked about was what he said about Israel and the war that's going on right now. He said nobody's hands are clean. And that jumped out at a lot of people because while it's true, you could have said that about the United States after 9/11, and you really wouldn't do that 10 days after 9/11. And if you did, you lost your job, you know. So that jumped out on people, and there's always been that little tension. Now, you have a quote in your book of what he says to Andrew Boren, where Barack Obama says, the problems in the Middle East are caused by the Jewish Americans community's inflexibility. That's a pretty stunning quote.
Right.
You know, we'll talk about the gay letter, but to me, this is more stunning, that he lays it all on the Jewish community. And I don't think it would be fair for anyone to say that he's done anything anti-Semitic, but there's always this little kind of trying to drag him to say what he has to say about Israel, and trying to drag him to say what he has to say about Farrakhan. And I don't know, and so I'm asking you, is that kind of the same thing as Republicans needing to satisfy the outside of their constituency? Because of course this is something occurring in Black America and in leftist politics, as you've already mentioned, this growing anti-Semitism. And so in terms of that quote that he just made a week or so ago, and that quote that you put in here in which he blames the Jews for all the problems that are going on in the Middle East.
In Black Chicago, during Barack's first 3 years there, 85 to 88, Louis Farrakhan, as the sort of inheritor of Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam, and in particular an NOI guy named Steve Coakley, who was working for Mayor Washington, Farrakhan's a big presence in Black Chicago during those years. And anti-Semitism is a problem, is a problem in the Black community. Even Jeremiah Wright, Obama's pastor in those years, who in most respects is a wonderful man, even Jeremiah has said back during 2009 or so some despicable anti-Semitic comments. And so to me, that was sort of in the water, if you will, in Black Chicago in those years because of Farrakhan's presence. And Jeremiah said positive things about Farrakhan, which is Farrakhan's always been a just evil figure. Farrakhan was, has bragged about being complicit in the assassination of Malcolm X, because the whole Nation of Islam leadership was complicit in Malcolm's killing. Barack also, in the 90s, when he was living in Hyde Park, was very close with several Palestinian Americans, Rashid Khalidi and his wife Mona. He had a fair Arab-American presence in his state Senate legislative district. So the tensions between Palestinians and Jews is something that Barack dealt with long before the presidency. Now, Barack had a number of prominent Jewish Chicago supporters in his multiple election runs, as well as people who like Andrew Boron, who were uncomfortable with him. So it's a complicated record. I think during the presidency, there's no question that Obama had a very negative experience with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister. And I think that's been a problem, and not just for Americans. You can see this in following Israeli politics too, that the repulsion that some moderates have had personally towards Netanyahu is what forced Netanyahu into a coalition with these despicable figures like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. I think people's inability to look at Israel beyond Netanyahu or to look at America beyond Donald Trump during the Trump presidency betrays a lack of sophistication. The United States is the United States irrespective of Donald Trump. Israel is Israel, another successful democracy, irrespective of Netanyahu or Ben-Gvir. People allow their overwhelming negativity towards a politician they despise, rightfully despise, to overshadow and take control of their feelings toward a country that is something far larger than even a chief executive.
And you write about an argument he has with Sheila about this kind of issue, which may or may not be kind of described in his book. We're not sure, because he does a composite. He doesn't, which he says he does to protect these women. It's kind of like Duke Ellington's book that doesn't ever mention a wife, but talks about his mother. It kind of puts him into one person, but the descriptions are very different. If you could talk about that and what Sheila said to you, which was really, I think, a profound moment for her in terms of her not really feeling like they were going to have a future together.
Right. The girlfriend, the composite girlfriend in Dreams from My Father is in some parts Alex McNear, some parts Genevieve Cook, some parts Sheila. Physically, the description is more Alex. Given Sheila's own family history of having family members on the Dutch side of her family who had actively worked in dangerous circumstances to protect Jews, that's a central part of Sheila's identity, a family thing to be, rightly celebrated. And so in 1988, when Barack is sort of passé about, this Jewish exhibit that they go to together, and doesn't seem to Sheila's view, doesn't seem to grasp how insidiously dangerous an evil anti-Semitism is. She's rightly very distressed, underwhelmed and distressed by that. It's a shortcoming in Barack's experiences. Barack had not, as of that time, really had any educational or personal experience with Judaism, with close friends who were identifiably Jewish. The organizers he was working with professionally were from Jewish family backgrounds, but they were not observant. Indeed, they were building this organization around Roman Catholic church parishes. And there was, some discomfort among the black community on the far south side. Why are these white guys who we think are Jewish, why are they the folks calling the shots in building the organization. So Barack is exposed to that African American discomfort with Judaism in multiple ways.
I want to ask you a little bit about some of the letters that you found. It may be that this is the last historical figure that's
Yes.
going to be written about who writes letters.
Yes.
Because certainly generations after do not do so. So you really run into a real treasure trove. Now, the one that's gotten all of the press is the one where he talks about, he says, in regard to homosexuality, I must say that I believe this is an attempt to remove oneself from the present, a refusal perhaps to perpetuate the endless farce of earthly life. You see, I make love to men daily, but in the imagination. So that's one of the letters. So you can talk about that, but also just how much effect did finding these letters have, and how were you able to convince these people to let you see these letters, which seems pretty hard to me.
Barack was a writer. Right from his undergraduate years at Columbia, when he's writing letters to Alex McNear, his girlfriend who's still in Los Angeles at that time, he's composing them. He was keeping a journal at that point. The first time I went to see him at the White House, sitting on the desk there in the Oval Office, he put up a pile of all these journals from back then as a way to sort of bait me, tease me. I still have these, but I'm not going to let you see them. That's close to a quote. And I actually think that he either drafted the letters in the journal and then copied them out, or he drafted the letters and then copied them into the journal. I think he, retained copies of those letters. When he goes to Europe for a good chunk of the summer of 1988 before starting Harvard, he's writing postcards to all sorts of people that he knows. That's how he was then. I mean, who mails postcards anymore? Or sends out 5-6 page handwritten letters. Both Alex and Genevieve Cook saved everything. Alex initially redacted, this is 2009, 2010, he's president. Alex redacted that one paragraph where he talks about homosexuality. And I don't think that it's a dramatically important sentence or two. As I've said previously in earlier interviews, all human beings have fantasy lives. So it's November of 1982. He's 21 years old. I don't think it's in any way astonishing. There are letters that Barack wrote to Sheila, which I've not seen, which Barack is very intent upon not having anyone see. I don't know what their future is down the road. That's a real long-term question. There's no question that Barack was extremely nervous in all of our conversations about those letters, because there's no question whatsoever that the relationship with Sheila was significantly more intense and of more serious duration than the earlier relationships with Alex and Genevieve.
So Barack is quoted saying that, these people want to write books about me, but there's really nothing to say. I didn't have an interesting life before I became president. Nothing much happened, and so they kind of want to make stuff out of what was really a very average existence. And you have this opportunity, I guess, 3 meetings that you have with Barack Obama to discuss the book you're writing. So is that kind of his tenor as he's talking to you, that this is really why are you even doing this, or how did those meetings go?
The tenor is defensive. The 3 conversations were not recorded. They're officially off the record, and so I mean, I have, some yellow legal pads with lots of notes, but I'm not generally doing any, direct quotations from those. The first long conversation in the Oval Office, he was, very concerned that I had discovered Sheila, that we had been corresponding. He, at one point, when he first learned of that, cold called Sheila out of the blue, I think to try to sort of keep her on the reservation, if you will. Then, after that first conversation, most of the book by that point was written, and so we agreed that Barack would read it in typescript, and over the course of the late summer, early fall of 2016, he read all of chapters 1 through 10, everything but the epilogue of Rising Star. And so that I went back twice in the fall of 16, once before the election and then once after. And we sat there in the president's dining room, the little room that's just west of the Oval Office, for 3 hours at a time. And he paged through his printed out copies of the manuscript, and looked at what comments he'd made, and so many of the things he wanted to touch on were, to my mind, sort of bemusing. Oh, I was fluent in Indonesian when he was a third grader, because I say that everyone who remembers him from then, didn't think he by any means mastered Indonesian. And there were some things that I was surprised he didn't in any way object to. There were things I thought he would flag, and he just let them pass. But with regard to Dreams from My Father, I think what most upset him was my conclusion that it is much more a work, that it's historical fiction, that it's not a reliable account of either the people or the events of those 3 years in Chicago. I think that's true. I don't think it should be seen as surprising in that regard. We've seen this over the years with civil rights movement veterans who've been interviewed a lot. Many people, were not interviewed enough, but people who are interviewed a lot, they develop a narrative, and they keep telling that narrative over and over, and so they're recalling their own account rather than recalling the event itself. And I think that's what happened with Barack and Dreams.
About his mother. A lot of people, since I've said that I was going to talk to you, people have said, ask him about the mother, because there's a lot of talk out there about her possibly being in CIA, hopping from this place to that place, being under the Ford Foundation grants, all of this. So I could see that you're not buying that, but tell us a little bit, because she's an unusual woman.
I mean, Ann Dunham was a sort of, saying hippie flower child would be overdoing it, certainly in a descriptive sense, but probably not in a spiritual sense. Ann's parents were the people who really raised Barack. This working class white couple living in a very modest apartment in a Honolulu high-rise. Neither of whom were very happy people. Ann, by that time, was living in Indonesia, sometimes working in Pakistan. She had ended up as this single mother. Barack's father was someone Barack only saw for a few weeks of his life when he was 10 years old. Barack Sr. had abandoned them, while, Barack Jr. was literally an infant. And Ann had remarried to an Indonesian graduate student who, once they moved to Indonesia, this guy, is sort of a junior corporate executive, and that's certainly not Anne's attraction towards the world either. There's some cockamamie stuff out there back from a decade ago that Stan Dunham, Anne's father, was some sort of intelligence agent. Stan was an underemployed insurance agent and nothing more. No, there's no intelligence community connections to any of this. And I mean, I myself, going back to my King work, I have 40 years ago pretty extensive experience with the FBI, with the CIA, with some other intelligence services. So I'm ahead of the curve, I think, of most folks in that sort of thing. But Barack, both through high school at this superb prep school that he's going to in Honolulu, and when he's at Occidental College for his freshman and sophomore years, his friendship network is mainly international students, students from the Middle East who are Muslim. He's not hanging out with the other black kids. And so as we noted earlier, even though he's living in Manhattan for 4 years when he finishes at Columbia and works these underwhelming jobs, he's in no way really much of a part of black New York at all. It's only when he goes to Chicago in 1985 that for the first time he's truly immersed in American black community life.
So let me ask you, again, I'm going to go back a little bit to the economics and the reality of doing a book like this, because it took 9 years. And, I presume you could have done it in 3 years, but a lot of it wouldn't have been in there. You wouldn't have found the person at the hotel who had the conversation with Barack Obama and a lot of other things. But let me ask you this. Brian Lamb, I watched the interview, and I don't really want to repeat people's questions, but this one was such a fascinating answer that I want to make this a part of my question, because he asked you something nobody else on earth would ask: why are there no pictures in the middle of your book? So when you describe what you had to do to do this book for 9 years, if you can explain first why you don't have any pictures in the book.
I forget what I said to Brian, because that's been 6.5 years now. But there are
you said you were required to pay.
Oh yeah, authors. Yeah, I mean, the only one of my books that has any pictures in it is my first book, Protest at Selma. Which has, because I'm analyzing the photos of the protests in Birmingham and Selma that went out and were on the front page of, most U.S. newspapers. But there are no pictures in Bearing the Cross. There are no pictures in Liberty and Sexuality, my big history of Roe v. Wade, because authors pay photo costs. And unless you can get pictures from, say, the Library of Congress, which doesn't charge you, it's an expensive proposition. I have a friend whom I won't cite by name here, had a book come out 6 months ago, and I went through this with him, where he was trying to get photo permissions for a variety of photos, and the relevant enterprise that controlled most of them refused, and some of the others are just too expensive. That's extremely the case when you're talking about any images from old television footage. Mm-hmm. There's a phenomenal interview that Harry Belafonte, whom we mentioned earlier, did with Dr. King on The Tonight Show, which, that's, even little clips of that are prohibitively expensive for documentary makers to actually get permission to use. I was able to do this book because of both Homerton College, my college at the University of Cambridge when I was in Britain, paying all my research expenses. And then once I came here to Pittsburgh, Pitt Law School, paying me a very nice salary, more than the amount of my teaching merited. and also giving me paid leave for multiple semesters. And so I owe a significant debt to Chip Carter, our former dean at Pitt, who handled all of that. You mentioned, not by name, Robert Elia, the motel owner up north of here, who had a memorable conversation with Barack when Barack's on his way to Chicago in August of 1985. I was able to find who owned that motel in 1985 thanks to one of our Pitt law librarians who went back and pulled the Pennsylvania property records from the 1980s and was able to tell me who owned that motel in 1985. And I then tracked the gentleman down by phone. And as soon as I got him on the phone, there was no doubt this was the right guy. He sounded identical to how Barack had described him in Dreams from My Father. But you don't write books like this to make money. And that's not true just of Dave Garrow. That's true of my closest friends who are serious historians. John Eig, who's done a King book. Josh Prager, who's done a superb biography of Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe of Roe v. Wade. For some of our junior colleagues who don't have full-time academic appointments, who are doing really important work, it's a hand-to-mouth enterprise. I mean, we've got one phenomenal younger colleague who, teaches English as a, second language classes in a foreign country. Some people have family money. Some people have spouses who have, very well-paying professional jobs. I was very fortunate, having a law professor salary. But none of us can live off of what you get paid by your publisher to do a book that takes even 5 years, never mind 8 or 9.
It just seems like there's so many philanthropists out there willing to pay, here's $10 million to redo James Madison's house, which I definitely appreciate, but a couple $100,000 to a young writer would make all of the difference.
That has never really existed, and it's good for you to highlight that. There are things like Guggenheim or the National Humanities Center that give people 1-year fellowships. And with most of those, whether it's at the Humanities Center in North Carolina, they want you to be resident there. There's one at the New York Public Library. Now, when you're doing the sort of books that myself or John Eig do, you don't want to have to be in Research Triangle Park or Midtown Manhattan full time. You've got to be out traveling around, finding people, going to archives. And even Guggenheim, which is I've probably over the years successfully written endorsement letters for 8, 9, 10 people who've won Guggenheims. That'll support you for the better part of a year, but you don't get 9 of them in a row.
Yeah. Let me finish off with this question, which is kind of looking at how Barack Obama's presidency is going to be seen in the future. And I'll bring up the Patriot Act. Very interesting as I'm reading your book, what a critic he is, how he says, even though only one senator voted against it, how he complimented that senator. He thinks he would have.
Right.
He does admit, given the pressure, I can't say I wasn't there with the pressure at the time, but I would have voted for it. And of course, his presidency is very different. We're now 15 years out from the beginning of it, I guess.
Right.
And we've had a little time to look at it. As far as I know, there is no historian doing a serious look at either any president since George Herbert Walker Bush. There's nobody out there writing these books about these people, which is like George Herbert Walker Bush. Everyone's gone now. It's too late to interview people. Barack Obama, as you say, is going to be the first president since before Hoover to have a presidential library without archives.
Yes.
So anyway, but And I don't think you're going to be willing to spend another 15 years on Barack Obama to write about his presidency. But how do you look at what his presidency is going to be looked at historically?
Let me say two sort of big things. I think the presidency, the Obama presidency, will increasingly be remembered as disappointing and underwhelming. Underwhelming with regard to what was anticipated to be its transformative impact on race relations in America. And as we touched on earlier, of course, across the course of the Obama presidency and since, I think it's unquestionable that race relations in the United States have deteriorated. And Black America, particularly urban Black American communities, particularly with regard to crime, are not better off now than they were in 2008, 2009. I think disappointing is going to be the historical legacy overseas, not just with what Russia did in 2014, not just with Syria, but how the Obama presidency also missed the ball on China. And it's going to be a painful acknowledgement that it was the Trump presidency that first frontally acknowledged how dangerous the Chinese Communist Party is to the world. Obama, as president, thought he could, sort of keep Iran on good behavior, keep China on good behavior, in much the same way that Benjamin Netanyahu thought he could keep Hamas on good behavior. None of those overly optimistic things turned out to be good bets. And it's quite striking that the Biden administration, even today, has really followed the Trump legacy on China, not the Obama one. Foreign affairs really matters for the presidency. And I don't think Barack fully appreciated that. When he was in the U.S. Senate, he'd had some very strong interests in things like Darfur in Western Sudan that, were not on anyone's radar screen. He went to Ukraine with Dick Lugar on the decommissioning of old Soviet nuclear weapons. So I think it's going to be a slow, gradual downhill trajectory. But it's 100% clear to me that neither Barack nor the people around him are going to aid, abet, encourage historians to work on the Obama presidency. Barack wants to once again write his version of the story and have that be accepted as the story, period, and does not want to have that corrected or contradicted. And I think it's without a doubt that's going to be a probably fatal hurdle for any serious historian for the balance of Barack's own life.
Of course, Obama, when he was asked what's the Obama doctrine, he said, "Don't do stupid shit."
Right.
Which I think we were expecting more, although if every presidency was that, it wouldn't be so bad. So thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.